and my dad couldn't really answer me, and he didn't look me in the eye because it was one of those rare times when Dad did not have the answer. That is all war, son. It is hell. Government propaganda and lies can convince a man to torture and murder his own neighbor if enough pressure is applied. I'm sorry you had to grow. You have to see this, son. If they ever have a war, son, and they make you go, you run, Mark, and you run fast. And you never go to any war. War is the rich and powerful and politicians using the poor and working class as cannon fodder to die for their evil politics, and you remember that, son. But through my tears I said, but Dad, you said that war years were the best years of your life when you were in the Navy, and this is so, so terrible. And my dad said, that's because I had my mates. I loved Betty and thought of her every day, and I loved the sea. And I was from a very poor place in the world, Mark. I was nothing. Just a small slum dweller from Birmingham, England. In the Navy, I went to all these exotic places in the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Italy, Malta, North Africa, and I didn't know about these terrible things until much later, after the war, when the truth always comes out, and it's usually far too late. Dad couldn't explain to me why Jews were targeted for this extraordinary persecution. In all my days at home, I had never heard him utter a bigoted word or remark of any kind. He was a sweet and charming person to all people, and he imbued upon me a great goodwill to all people without even the slightest suggestion of prejudice. My continual stream of questions about man's inhumanity to man at that age of 13, 14, and 15 perplexed my father, and he found it challenging to explain to me in terms that made any sense to a young man as to why there was bigotry, hatred, and war in the world. But he often added, that's why I brought you into this world in Canada, son, where you wouldn't experience these prejudices I experienced in England, or being poor, or being working class, or of a class system, or for other people it's being judged because they are Jewish or Negro, any of those other things that aren't important. That's why I'm glad you're Canadian, son, so you will never know those attitudes that cause misery to a person for no good reason. My dad worked at the 3M factory in London, Ontario, where I'm from, and that's where he worked his whole life until he retired in 1981 after 30 years of service to that company. I knew his best friend at work was Nick Sauter, from whom I fondly called Mr. Nick. Since I was 4 years old, I knew Mr. Nick was German-born, and I asked my dad how he could be friends with a German man who, when for 5 years Germans were trying to kill my dad, and he replied, Mark, that is war. When war is over, you have to forget all that. There is no point to hate or holding grudges. Life is so short, and we must go on. My dad was the greatest, wisest man I ever knew, and with just grade 8 schooling, as was common for poor English people in the Great Depression. But I marveled at almost every day growing up as I watched him fix anything, build anything, answer all my questions, or know where to find the answer. He never raised his voice to my mother, and he certainly never struck her. He drank one beer, a bottle of Molson Canadian, once a week at 8:30 on Saturday night as the CBC telecast of Hockey Night in Canada began. I had a glass of pop, and each of us had a bowl of Lay's potato chips. Then, in 1965, the Leafs would be broadcast in progress about 15 minutes into the first period because Tommy Hunter's Jubilee, an hour-long music variety show, occupied the 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. spot. In those days of the original 6 hockey teams, hockey started at 8 p.m., and the games started at 7 p.m. were broadcast in their entirety, starting only in 1969. I only ever had one argument with my dad my whole life, long after I left home, which I did at 17. The argument was when I was 31 years old and Dad was 65. It was on Christmas Day 1990, 7 days before Canada and the U.S. would begin Operation Desert Storm, the bombing and invasion of Iraq, after Saddam Hussein had his troops invade Kuwait and seize their oil fields. Kuwait was an invention of the Western powers at the end of World War II. Originally, it was part of Iraq before then. Throughout that December, I had been protesting Canada's participation in the build-up to the bombing, called Operation Desert Shield, by carrying a sign in front of Wolseley Barracks, the home of the 1st Canadian Regiment, on Oxford Street in my hometown of London. Canada was contributing a squadron of CF-18 Starfighter bombers to contribute to the largely American bombardment of Iraq. In the weeks prior to the aerial bombing, which started on January 1st, there was me and 25 to 100 people protesting each day in front of those barracks. But once the aerial bombardment began on the new year, it was the It was the event that really made CNN, for example, a worldwide phenomenon. It captured the horrific bombing live in real time on TV so everybody could watch. Well, I found myself alone that day in Wolseley Barracks, protesting with one sign I would wear like a sandwich board draped over me. My sign said, "Canadian bombs on Iraqi people is wrong and immoral." The other protesters who were with me before the bombing began were nowhere to be found now, and in front of Wolseley Barracks there was just me. All had seemed to buy into the belief that once your country is at war, you, quote, you have to support the troops and support your country. Every day as I walked a snowy protest line in front of the 1st Canadian Regiment Barracks by myself, after the bombing commenced, dozens of insults would be hurled at me every hour. I dodged bottles that were thrown at me from cars careening by. Snowballs were often lobbed my way from cars. Even bags of excrement, human, dog, and cat, were tossed my way by passing vehicles. I was stunned by this behavior. I couldn't get my head around the popular belief that protesting your country at war was only acceptable before any actual killing began. Once the killing began, it was somehow treasonous to point out the horror and immorality of killing innocent men, women, and children from the sky above once it was actually happening. Most shocking was that my dad joined in this chorus. On Christmas Day, 1990, as the family met at my brother Matt's house on Springbank Drive in London for our turkey dinner, Dad was spouting the popular propaganda of the corporate media and our governments, that Saddam Hussein was the new Hitler, that Saddam ordered babies ripped from hospital incubators, that women were being raped en masse, and of course most of it was untrue upon later verification. I couldn't believe my ears, and Dad and I went at it at a thunderous pace for 2 or 3 hours until the holiday spirit was pretty well ruined. I yelled at him in the very heat of argument, "You told me 20 years ago that if they ever had a war, I should run away. You said all wars were lies and deception so the powerful could kill the innocent, the poor, the working classes, and now you are saying these crazy lies yourself, giving support to this insane killing." Months later, when Saddam Hussein was allowed to stay in power amidst the slaughter and wreckage of the ordinary Iraqi conscripts and citizen, I asked my father what he thought about the bombing now. He sighed and said, "Let us never speak of that again." I learned war can indeed divide families, if only for one day. If you watch the DVD about my work, The Prince of Pot, U.S. versus Marc Emery, one of the extra scenes is a debate between my older brother Stephen, an Anglican Christian minister, and myself about Canada's participation in the occupation of Afghanistan. Steve's only son, Corporal Benjamin Emery of the Princess Pat Regiment, had returned from his second tour of duty in Afghanistan, and Steve was proud of his son. But even though we hadn't seen each other in 3 years, we argued immediately about Afghanistan and the Canadian soldiers there. Steve was saying, "You don't believe we have to stop Islamofascism before it comes to Canada?" and words I regarded as pure propaganda. It's quite the heated debate which you can see on the DVD, but then happily we stopped arguing suddenly and spoke warmly of other matters.